So let's just get into it. So this is creating spaces for special education. So let me first tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Greg Nelson. I'm a researcher at School Outfitters. And what I do is I study the link between the physical environment and educational outcomes. And so really what I look at is how do we arrange furnishings? How do we, get the type of accommodations? How do we create the walkways? How do we create the efficiencies that we need in order for teachers to teach in the way they want and in ways that maximize the student's experience as well? Just a couple other things about me. I'm a psychology department instructor at Sinclair Community College in Dayton, Ohio. And germane to this talk, I teach lifespan development. So I teach everything from birth through the lifespan. So one of the things that I study are how different pedagogies work at different age groups. And lastly, I want to say that I am a former caseworker at the Butler County Board of Developmental Disabilities. And this was before I went to graduate school, and I had the good fortune of working with a human factors engineer who really worked on cognitive and physical assistance for many of our clients. Now, I served adults with mild intellectual disabilities and helped them to kind of live independently. And so when I went to graduate school, I was really taken by that work. And I went into human factors psychology, kind of, off of the things that I learned from our human factors engineer at the Board of Developmental Disabilities. So I'm really happy to present this webinar because I get an opportunity to talk about, something that's near and dear to my heart. So when we talk about making spaces for special education, there's this interplay that has to happen between you, and you are the experts in what you need. You're the experts in special education. You're the experts of your own educational spaces. You're the experts with your students' needs. And when we really talk about, like for instance, an IEP accommodation, I mean, you're the person who knows what the letter of the law is with those IEP accommodations. So you know exactly, the thing that you're looking for to get the assistance that you want. And so then when you talk to the vendor, the us side of this equation, we really talk about, what kind of expertise does that vendor lend? In our case, we have research and design experience. I'm a researcher, and I spend all of my time researching best options for student populations, best options for teacher populations, also the ergonomics and in the designs. In our case, we have a design group that is really dedicated to educational furnishings. And so through that combination of your expertise and our expertise, we can come up with solutions that will provide the best fit for whatever it is that you need. And so with that, I want to talk about the agenda here really quickly. So first of all, space design. We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about space design in two contexts. We'll talk about it for mainstreaming, which is, including students with IEPs in typical learning environments. And then we'll talk about space design for specific special education areas that you might have, whether it's a sensory room or a tranquility room or a research room or that kind of thing. And then, once we talk about the design, then we'll kind of get a little bit more granular and talk about the furnishings. So, what kind of furnishings help with accommodation? And then what kind of furnishings help with inclusion, and then what kind of furnishings help with general efficiency for students and for teachers. And then we'll talk about space planning. So, when we go through space planning, I just want to talk about some of the questions you might want to ask, some of the things you might want to consider when putting together an environment based on your needs. And then, we could talk about vendor choice. So let's talk about space design first. And I really want to talk about, start with mainstreaming. We see actually in many states, in most states, there are goals to have more and more a greater proportion of students with IEPs in a typical classroom, 80% of their time. And so with these goals, we're going to see a lot more in the way of IEPs in the way of requests for accommodation. So let's talk about what are the needs. And really, I break it down into three things. Accommodation, which is really fulfilling the IEP requirements. It's really making sure that each student has reasonable accommodation for the things that they need in order to succeed in their class. So really, we're talking about maximizing that opportunity for the student. But then after we talk about accommodation, then we have, the even greater kind of question about inclusion. So how do students really truly feel immersed in their learning activities? And how do all children in the class have a true feeling of group membership? And what are some of the aspects of design that can lend to this idea of a true feeling of group membership? Not only okay, I'm part of this class and I have some accommodative furnishings and equipment, but okay, how can I really feel a part of everything? And then efficiency. So when we talk about efficiency, we're really talking about optimizing your in-class time and reducing the burden on students and teachers. And so I just want to, with those three things in mind, I want to get into that. So there are different types of classrooms that are set up for different types of activities. And so this particular classroom is a classroom that's set up for accommodations, for motor accommodations, and for sensory or privacy accommodations. And I just want to bring out a few things. Let's talk about accommodation first. So when we talk about accommodation, what we see here are a few things that lend to accommodation. For instance, we have sit-to-stand desks, and these sit-to-stand desks are denoted by the red stools that are there in the kind of the back center of this image. And when we think about that, we say, okay, well, if you have to stand all of a sudden, maybe it's because of an ADHD issue or some other motor issue, but you need to stand up. You can do that on the fly. You can do that without really breaking the flow of what's happening in the class. And so along with that, we have offered there in that same area sit-to-stand stools that allow you to either kind of rest a little bit while you're in that standing position, or you can just put them aside and you can just stand up. When you want to sit down, they go to seating height. So what's so cool about that? Well, one thing that's really interesting about that is that if you make it part of your design, then you won't have students with IEPs feeling like, well, they're the person with a special accommodation. Many students can have access to these tables, and you don't necessarily have to have an IEP to have these tables. But the interesting thing is the inclusion part is that that I can make this part of my overall design for the class, and by doing that, then somebody doesn't feel like the odd person out. Going on for accommodations, you'll see in the very back in that right corner, you'll see shell chairs. And these shell chairs have a kind of surround to them, lending a sense of privacy, much like what might happen in a study carrel. So even though you are part of the group and it gives you the feeling that you're still part of the group, you also have a bit of isolation when you need just to kind of isolate yourself a little bit from the group, and so you can maintain your focus. So there's another example of accommodation within this room. Lastly, I wanted to talk about flexible arrangement items. So we have flexible arrangement tables in this case. And in terms of flexible arrangement, the accommodation is well, if I'm part of group work and then I need to have some privacy, I can pull any one desk away and I can work individually for a little while. And then when I'm ready to join the group, I can come back into the group. And again, the thing about this is that this is a whole design for, and I'm just using the word typical students to mean students without IEPs, where students with IEPs can mainstream in a typical learning environment, and they can really feel like part of the group. And if variety is part of your design, then it's much easier to foster that sense of inclusion, because if you have more choice, and in this case, you see a lot of choice in seating options, then you find that it's not so different to have a sit to stand desk, or it's not so different to have a stool that rocks back and forth for fidgeting and that kind of thing. And so this way we create efficiencies. I do want to make one other note about this particular rendering before we move on, is that you see that these group configurations kind of fit into these compact pods. And the neat thing about that is it creates more ample walkways. So you get more spacious walkways when you can consolidate the groups, so that if you have a person with a wheelchair, or is walking with braces, or some other kind of mobility assistance, that person can more easily travel to the pod that person needs to travel to. So this is one example, and there are a number of things that make this accommodative, but I want to move on because I want to talk about these in subsequent configurations. So that was a group learning kind of setup, and here is something that's more of an interactive lecture setup. So when we talk about interactive lectures, typically people face the front, and in this case, this is interactive lectures with desks, and you see the same sit to stand desks, you see the sit to stand stools, different. It's a different product, but it still allows you that sit to stand opportunity. And I wanted to bring up, there are chairs that are shown in the forefront here, that are these light blue chairs. They're really thick, heavy chairs. And well, they're not heavy in weight, but they allow a lot of stability. And so these are thick plastic. They're very durable. They have deep seat buckets. They have very scalloped and supportive backrests, and these are for people who have an extra need for stability. Now, I'm going to bring this up also when I talk about furnishings, but if you notice the other furnishings around the room, these furnishings have, there are chairs, there are other blue chairs that look a lot like these heavy-duty chairs. And so the interesting thing about that is that if you make things look very similar, you can also foster that inclusion. So when we talk about the aesthetic of the room, how can we set up this aesthetic such that, again, we don't have anybody who feels like the odd person out? I want to draw attention to a few other things that help to make this an efficient setup. One of the first things you'll notice is that there are rolling dividers. And these rolling whiteboard dividers serve two purposes. First of all, they can roll wherever they're needed. And so what can happen is you bring them over, and maybe there is a student who is better at visual communication than verbal communication. And so what you do in that case is you allow these things to roll exactly to that person's space, and then that person can maybe communicate through visual means, to supplement what that person is doing verbally within the group. Also, these dividers go from largely the floor to about 5 feet tall. So if a person's in a wheelchair, that person has an opportunity to write at that person's level, and a person who can fully stand can write at a higher level. And so it allows a lot of flexibility and accommodation there. Also, if somebody needs to break off from the group and have privacy, these dividers can serve as, well, dividers, right? And so they can allow you to have that privacy for sensory needs. Because we've created compact groupings, we have ample walkways that allow these rolling dividers to move where they are needed. Likewise, you'll see rolling storage, so that if whatever materials you might need can roll very easily to the student, and that way the student can kind of access those, especially if you have a student who, with an IEP, and you put that student at the end of the pod, then it's a very easy reach. If you have bins, you can bring out the bins and have it there for easy setup, easy cleanup, something that creates an efficiency both for the teacher and for the student. And also I want you to draw your attention to the teacher desk here. Again, it's a rolling desk. It has an ample tabletop, but it rolls to wherever it's needed. So if the teacher needs to do a demonstration, that kind of thing, you have rolling units that allow things to get to where they need to go. And again, I really want to emphasize that if you put this variety in the design, it's good for everybody. So, I mean, this is something that's just good 21st century design, is to give variety, choice, ownership, that kind of thing. And that then also lends to more inclusion when you have students with IEPs joining your class. This is a blended learning rendering. And so in this case, the central tables are really for doing group work. And then the tables along the edges are for desktops, laptops, that kind of thing. And so what's the cool thing about this? So these have tilt tables. And in this case, the tilt tables are very similar in look to the other tables that are around the room. And so those tilt tables can allow people individually to set the workspace at the angle that they need in order to accomplish what they need to accomplish, in order to accommodate a postural need while writing, drawing, or that kind of thing. Again, you see the heavy duty chairs in there, but they're intermixed with a whole bunch of other chairs. So like, a person without an IEP could choose to have a stool without a back, or a stool that rocks. And so when you have a student with an IEP who really needs to rock because that person needs to get out a lot of energy, again, that person won't be like a standout. When we talk about technology, in many cases, the ability to include students in projects really might depend on their ability to work digitally. So like, for instance, working on things like Google Docs, or shared spreadsheets, or shared presentation software, those kinds of things. And so the blended learning room gives the opportunity for students with and without IEPs to work on that technology. And maybe students with IEPs might have a little more time at the computer, so they can kind of express their thoughts and participate in the projects through their digital media. Also, when we talk about a big thing, remediating learning loss, we talk about that with COVID especially. And I know that the special education sector had been hit very hard by COVID in terms of learning loss. Then we can have more opportunity in this blended learning environment for the digital technology to allow for more mastery. So this again is all something that could go into the design for everyone, and that way everyone benefits from the variety and choice that's involved in the activities that they do. Okay, so let's talk about special education areas. So we talk about special education areas. I want to start with sensory rooms. So let's say you have a need or desire for a sensory room, and really there are a number of applications by which you could use sensory rooms. And one of the applications for a sensory room is to be extremely interactive and engaging, to stimulate the senses in students, and to kind of get them to be very, very highly interactive. And then there is the sensory room for being interactive and calming. So students can still interact with the projections, can still interact with many of the light displays and the bubble tubes and this kind of thing. But you see the colors are more muted. It's made for being more calming. And this is something that you would know what you want. And that way you can kind of tell your vendor, us, what it is that you need, and we can come up with a solution. So really, when we talk about this, I want to talk about some design considerations that might help you with your sensory rooms. And the first really is location. So when we think about where to put a sensory room, we want to really think about, well, what are some places that aren't really well trafficked? What are some places that kind of reduce some distractions from ambient noise, or the visuals of people walking by? So those kind of things are very helpful in understanding where to put the sensory room. Also, what about accessibility? Is it accessible from something like a ground floor? Is it close to an elevator? Is it close to a central location where students, especially those who are in most need of a sensory room, can access it very easily, especially given any restrictions on mobility? And then we talk about control. So what kind of control do you have from ambient lighting, from like windows that might be in the room, or glass walls, or that kind of thing? And then what kind of controls do you have over the displays in the room? And what kind of control do you want people to have? So do you want it so that the educator sets up all the displays and they don't really change? Or do you want it something very interactive where the students' actions can change the kinds of displays that show up in the room, maybe changing the colors of things, maybe changing the patterns of lights that show up, maybe changing the projections that happen? So we want to think about that in terms of control. Then safety. We want to make sure that if students with wheelchairs are in the room, students with maybe some balance and coordination issues, that we avoid tripping hazards and falls. We want to make sure that the flooring facilitates those mobility aids. When we talk about comfort, of course, ventilation is a big deal, right? Let's just talk about the sense where you put, maybe in a sensory room, you put some aromatherapy. And what might be great aromatherapy for one student might be entirely noxious to another student. So, what are some of the comfort features, like having great ventilation to get those scents out of the room, that might be very helpful. Also, just good ventilation allows good airflow while you're in the room. And then ease of use. So what kind of personal items will people be bringing with them? What might they need to store? What kind of manipulatives might you have? Might you have like things like fidget spinners, remotes, that kind of thing? And then how do you intend to store those? Not make those the main feature of the room, but at least have those available so that students can easily just store their things and then just immerse themselves in that sensory experience. Somewhat akin to sensory rooms are relaxation rooms. And when I think of relaxation rooms, I really think of them as areas of refuge. Basically, somebody, and this doesn't have to be a person with an IEP. This could be any student that you have. But it's a place where students can go if they become overwhelmed, either with a sensory overwhelming, or just a hard, difficult time, that kind of thing. But they're areas of refuge where students can just kind of decompress. So what are some things that we might need to know there? So, first of all, think about the areas you want in a relaxation room. So the first thing I think of is an area for calming down, an area for decompression. And so when I think of that space, I think of a space that's really something for a lot of soft seating, a lot of comfortable seating, that it's a variety. Like, for instance, if you look in this upper image, you see soft rockers and you see bean bags. But the idea is just to kind of give yourself a soft place to just kind of relax and decompress. You want to think about those soothing color choices and soft flooring options, maybe like rugs. Maybe the rugs have patterns that are calming as well, like maybe, like water, or like rocks in a stream, or something like that. And so just think about what you want in those calming areas. And then secondly, you might want to think about whether you want areas where people can reflect or express themselves. So, for example, it might be very calming to write your thoughts. You've heard this: write down all of your angry thoughts and crumble them up and throw them away. Or the idea of drawing out your feelings or some other form of expression. Do you want to add that to a relaxation room? And if you do want to add that into a relaxation room, so how do you do it? In this case, let's take well, in all of these cases, we have tables that have chairs at them, and people can then just kind of write, draw, whatever. They could do puzzles, they could, whatever it is that might help them in that time of need for refuge. And then some other useful items to think of when you're thinking of relaxation rooms are really what kind of biophilia do you have there? And by biophilia, it's a closeness to nature. So things like plants, maybe like the little trickling waterfalls, the little tiny kind of things you could put on a table, nature scenes that you have on prints, rug patterns with nature scenes. What kind of attempt do you give to biophilia, to bring biophilia in? And then storage solutions. So we have we might have some art items, you might have some fidget items, those kind of things. What kind of storage solutions do you need from there? And then, aromatherapy. Again, people like aromatherapy a lot, but the thing to be careful of is that one person's happy place with aromatherapy might be another person's just kind of annoyance. So we want to think about how we might use that. Moving on, I want to talk about tutoring and mentoring rooms. So there will be times, obviously, when you want to, possibly have students with IEPs work with special education professionals. So maybe a speech therapist or a language therapist, a writing therapist, that kind of thing, who can help with, just kind of, scaffolding up students to where they need to be to then fully participate in typical classrooms. So, if we look at the things that we need there, let's think about the workspaces. So what kind of variety of workspaces do you need? How well can you adjust the workspaces, maybe with mobile tables and that kind of thing, to give you the configurations you want? Very often when I observe special educators doing some sort of like I say, a speech therapy or a literacy sort of thing, I often see people sitting around in like a semicircle, and then the teacher will be in the middle of that semicircle. And then other times students might need to be individual and off on their own. So how do you kind of create that sort of a flexibility to allow that to happen? And then when you configure that space, what kind of things do you need to consider? Like, for instance, in each of these renderings, there's a consideration for a breakout area. If somebody becomes too stressed, too overloaded, and needs to kind of have an individual calm down time while staying within the room. How do you, what kind of student to student or student to teacher groupings do you want? And then again, I always hit this idea of ample walkways, because ample walkways in a typical setting create efficiencies. And then when we layer on the need for mobility devices and that kind of thing, we want to make sure that we have ample walkways there. And then, of course, storage solutions. There are a number of different kinds of storage solutions, and each has an advantage, right? So if you have, say, mobile storage, they go where they need to go. But if you have stationary storage, then that's a consistent place where every time you know exactly what's going to be there. So you want to weigh what it is that you want. If you have bin shelving, it helps you to store things in small, especially small items, and it helps you to efficiently get things. If you have open shelving, what it serves as a cognitive aid, so that cognitive aid will say, oh yeah, I see that book over there, I can use that as a resource. So again, this is where I'm talking about the synergy between you and us to kind of figure out what it is that you might need in that case. They're resource rooms. So resource rooms, really, they're design considerations here. It's really, these are multi-purpose areas. These are areas that can be used by many students. It doesn't have to be just students with IEPs. They could be really used for counseling sessions. They could be used for guidance counseling. They could be used for quick quick meetings, that kind of thing. But they can also be really good spaces for things like mental health counseling or guidance counseling, or some sort of family intervention. So these are spaces that could have lots of purposes. So when you think about your resource rooms, you want to think, okay, what are the purposes of those rooms? And then, how do we lay out that space such that we maximize the usage of that space? And so what you see here in these three different renderings, you see, and they're very small, but you see very different ideas for laying out resource rooms, based on the different kinds of activities you want to do there. So really think about, they all kind of have in common comfortable seating that invites people into the space. But then from there, what do you need in terms of, adjustable height tables or long tables or round tables, or, what do you need in order to facilitate the kinds of conversations that you need to facilitate there? And gross motor therapy rooms. So, this is an opportunity for a therapist to work on things like posture, gait, balance, those kinds of things. And so, and there are many different kinds of therapy rooms. This is just one example, but just some design considerations are, what kind of room do you have for the various types of equipment that you need to put in there? And, again, this is really kind of finely tuned to whatever it is that your students need and whatever your physical therapist, your occupational therapist needs. So, you just want to consider all those different types of equipment that'll go in there. You want to consider how you're going to cushion your floor surfaces for things like stretching or resting, or if you have people working on balance, if they stumble or fall, how are we going to cushion those floor surfaces? And then what do you need for your therapist? In this case of the rendering, we see a mobile teacher stand that's a laptop caddy, and it also has some storage bins, and it has some things. How do you help the therapist to maybe interact with your learning management system or whatever else it is, so that on the fly they can just type in their notes about how therapy is going, and you can have an immediate kind of reporting and connection with the equipment that you're using. So, and again, you want to think about storage for manipulatives and therapy. So really, those are rooms that I wanted to bring up, and types of rooms, and I wanted to really bring out the design. I want to talk about this overall design first before I end the furnishings, because I think the overall design really matters a lot. In that variety can really help with inclusion, because all people benefit from having a variety. But I do want to talk now about furnishings specifically. So let's talk about furnishings that lend to accommodation. So first thing, we talked about tilt top tables, and we talked about these lightweight chairs with extra support. I said they were heavy duty, but at the same time, they're really easy to move around. So when you talk about having accommodation, you can have students who need some motor help to kind of be in many different places in the room if you have a variety of seating that allows for that heavy duty sort of support. Mobile workspaces. So, that is huge. So mobile workspaces can help with accommodation quite a bit, because if somebody needs to isolate, they can. We can put people into, not just people with IEPs, but students in general, into the kind of groups that most readily facilitate their work. And then adjustable height chairs and tables, of course, to help with things like, well, I need to stand now, or I need to sit now, those kinds of things. Privacy accommodations. So there are a number of different ways of creating privacy accommodations. I talked about the shell chairs before. You can also bring in carrels, things that allow you to be part of the group, while at the same time having a little bit of barriers to kind of reduce distraction. So those are very helpful for privacy accommodations. You can also just get tabletop dividers if that will serve the trick. So, if you can get away with clear dividers so that you have, this physical divider without breaking the visual, that'd be great. If you need opaque tabletop dividers, well, you could get those as well. But the point is to let people still be part of the group while having some bit of privacy. Some options for fidget accommodations, bouncy bands. It might be something as simple as that, where you just have, okay, I have these chairs and I have somebody who just really needs to get energy out, and let me just get these bouncy bands. Bouncy bands are very, very popular. There are other ways of doing this too. You can have like having the little cushioned foot stompers, or the feet that go on the glides of the chair that kind of lets you kind of rock a little bit. But these are ways of just taking a typical chair and putting some accommodation to let people fidget. And then if you talk about furnishing specifically for fidgeting, we could talk about things like active sitting stools that rock. In this case, the active sitting stools rock in any direction, so it doesn't have to be just back and forth. Or it could be something like a rocker. In this case, the rocker is a soft seating rocker, but we also have rocking units that are with the more typical chair shell. So either way, these things help out with fidget accommodations. Oh, we're talking about auditory accommodations. One thing that I'm seeing a lot more of is people using headphones and earbuds to kind of isolate sounds, or kind of give them some soothing sounds, or to do some noise canceling so that they can kind of calm down, and kind of refocus themselves. But there are a number of ways that this can be done, right? There are, sound machines that make white noise, if your area can accommodate that. But there are also, on the individual level, noise canceling headphones, units that make different kinds of soothing sounds. There are earplugs, those kind of things that really help for people to stay engaged, stay with the group, but then have the auditory accommodation that they need. Okay, so we look at inclusion. Inclusion really, again, that feeling of being a full part of the group. I think of things like, group configurations. What kind of group desks or group tables can you put together? Can they be arranged very flexibly so you can have individual time when you need it and group time when you can? Do they have height adjustability so you can accommodate mobility devices like wheelchairs, those kind of things? But these group configurations, especially when you have these compact pods, really help to kind of foster inclusion. And then going along with group spaces, having variety for everyone, sit to stand options, whiteboard tops. I didn't talk about whiteboard tops with regard to tabletop and desktop, and I think there's something cool about that, because again, if people can express themselves visually, that might be a great thing. And if those whiteboard tops are right there on your desk or on your table, that allows people to express themselves right at the point, and that way you don't need to bring extra equipment over. You just have that there. When we talk about seating, I talked a little bit about this before. We talk about having typical seating look somewhat like your accommodative seating. To what extent can you achieve that aesthetic so that we have less of a standout item and just kind of more of a good flow visually with your accommodative seating items? And again, same thing I talked about with the desks, having the ability to flexibly arrange, having the ability to adjust the height. Those things are all helpful. And again, seating variety, sit to stand options, mobility, all those things help with the configurations you need in order to get the inclusion that you want. Media. I talked about the cool thing about the portable dry erase boards and the dividers. Those things give you the visual medium, but they also allow you to use them as separators if need be. And then you have things like portable dry erase boards, those things that are kind of like whiteboard slates, if you will, and then people can just carry them with them, and so they always have a visual communication device with them. I talked a little bit about the importance of technology. And so we talk about things that facilitate technology so that students with IEPs can be included with the rest of the class in terms of shared documents, shared spreadsheets, that kind of thing. How do we keep their devices enabled? And so whatever we can do to create power enabled furnishings, charging towers, having some it fosters some mobility if people can move from place to place and they know they're always going to keep their devices charged. Those kinds of things are very helpful items for inclusion. And lastly, efficiency. So we talk about products for efficiency. First of all, I want to talk about teacher furnishings because mobile teacher desks and teacher chairs help to move the teacher wherever that he or she is needed. So it might be the case that this tabletop might have some item that they need for demonstration, and then you can wheel that over to a specific pod and kind of facilitate conversations and project work there. Especially when teacher furnishings have a small footprint, they maneuver around the room easily, and you can take advantage of those ample walkways to allow the teacher to get to where he or she needs. And then we talked a little bit about this with therapy, but the presentation carts and the demonstration carts, especially those that have a lot of storage that allow you to use technology very easily, those kind of things that really let you on the fly, record your notes and help out with presentation anywhere in the room. In many cases, short throw projectors allow teachers to project onto a wall or a screen or a smartboard, what they might need from multiple places across the room. And in storage, I really like mobility a lot because when you have mobile storage units, you really let equipment get to where they need to go. And in this case, you see 3 different kinds of mobile storage units. You see the bin storage and towers, you see the text storage, and in this case as a demonstration surface on the top. And then here we have the open shelving, which allows for easy access. But really, we'll have to think about various aspects of this, right? So maybe you color code your bins so you always know that the red bins hold fidget spinners and the green bins hold some like a squishy ball or something like that, or it just had you have color coding for each student or that kind of thing. So you want to think about how to best kind of arrange your storage and get the units that you need to facilitate the kind of teaching and learning that you want in your room. All right, so now we've talked about spaces, we've talked about furnishings. Now let's talk about space planning a little bit. And so let's talk about needs analysis. This is something that we at School Outfitters do all the time. So when you work with a consultant at School Outfitters, really what we're trained in really well is needs analysis. And so really when we think about this, so there are a number of questions to ask. And first of all, let's think about the purpose. So, what is your purpose in creating this room? Is it mainstreaming? Is it tutoring, mentoring, or development? Is it to have some mental health or stress reduction sort of effect? So the immediate purpose might be like apparent right away, but then when we dig into that, is there anything else? Are there any secondary or tertiary purposes that your space has? And how can we create the kind of environment that'll facilitate even those secondary and tertiary things? And part of that will come from knowing the use cases. So, when you talk about use cases, is it only for in-school use for teachers and students? Is it for therapist use? And when we talk about therapist use, is that during the school time or is that before school or after school? After school use are your spaces going to also be used for maybe some after school activities. Well, I'll give you an example of things that could be used at any time, right? You might have a resource room, and that might be used by multiple people for multiple things. It might be used for a guidance counselor to help people with college applications. It might be used for mental health therapy. It might be used for speech therapy. So, all those things, we need to kind of understand those use cases. And then to what extent is the community going to use some of these things? I know when I worked at the Board of Developmental Disabilities, we worked in conjunction with schools all the time. And sometimes, there's some shared use involved. So to what extent is there shared use, and what are the things that people need to look out for, not look out for, but to consider when a community uses it outside of your school. So, just some things to think about with regard to the objectives. And then goals and metrics. And this is one thing that I don't want to overlook, because, when you look at this, you can say, well, how much efficacy did we have when we made this change? And so, that depends on what you want to do, right? So you say, well, I want people to be more social and more interpersonal. Well, you could create a metric by which you have people count conversations. You can look at the number of times a student with an IEP becomes a project lead. You could look at the number of edits that a student with an IEP gave to a shared document, those kind of things. And you can count those metrics and see if your change had an effect. If you have an academic or engagement metric, you could look at grades. That's a very easy way of looking at it. I talked about, participation in shared documents. You can look at that. There are a number of ways that you can look at academics, or you could look at indicators of behavioral wellness. Like you say, okay, I just want to give people an overall feeling of a good space, a safe space, an inclusive space. In which case you might want to look at certain metrics like attendance. You might say, well, is attendance better, especially with students with IEPs, or have I reduced the number of behavioral incidents that have occurred? There are these kind of ways of kind of saying, well, if we create a more inclusive space, a more inviting space, a more participatory space, then we should see people wanting to be in that space. And so we should see attendance increasing, those kinds of things. So, when you talk with us about what it is that you want, we can kind of help with understanding goals and metrics. And then, of course, there are the things that you definitely need to take in consideration, like the dimensions of the room, where your electric outlets are, what kind of control do you have about ambient light and sound, what's the capacity of the room, what are some accessibility issues around the room, do you have any themes that you need to make sure are in the room, like do you need to do things in school colors, do you need to have consistency from one room to another, what are some of those room specifications. And then lastly, must have amenities. Sometimes people say, I need this, and that becomes the centerpiece of the room. I must have this. I must have this projection in my sensory room, or I must have these tilt tables. And then we can start to design around that to say, okay, what other things can lend to the accommodation and inclusion within that room. Okay, then there's logistics. So there's the idea of like, okay, what's the budget for the project? When is the room going to be available? Is it a renovation? How are we going to deal with furniture removal? If we have, delivery, what kind of things do we need to know about delivery deadlines or call ahead services or, delivery locations? Do you need something delivered to your district warehouse? And then we need to kind of like pull that stuff into the specific school. And then, move in. What kind of things do you need in order to properly assemble these furnishings? And then what do you need for installation? And do you need a service, or is this something that your people are going to do? Again, so these things are all part of the needs analysis, these educational objectives, space considerations, and logistics that kind of help to facilitate that conversation. And lastly, I was going to talk about vendor choice. So really, you want a vendor who is going to make things easy for you. So when you talk about the relationship that you have with a vendor with special education, there are a number of things that you need to kind of consider. In-house expertise. So do they do the research? Do they have a product design development team? Do they have a really experienced, knowledgeable sales group? Can they consult with me on things? And do they actually have educators on staff so they kind of know the issues involved in education? I mean, in my case, I teach at a community college, but at School Outfitters, we have people who have run the gamut from pre-K through 12, and then of course me with higher education, and others who have done higher education as well. So not only do we help to understand the furnishings, we understand how they work in an educational context. And then how easy is this buying process? Like for instance, if you were to look at our website, schooloutfitters.com, you would see rooms that are kind of created as templates that you could look at and kind of say, oh, I like this, I want to add this, I want to remove that. So do they already have they already thought through some of these layouts, and is it easy for you to kind of understand the layouts that people have created? Another thing I want to talk about is really having strong vendor relationships. In School Outfitters' case, we have very strong vendor relationships. So if something's not on the site, we can go back to a vendor and say, well, is there something that can help match your needs? And we have a lot of assortment. But then when we go back to the vendor, we can say, well, is there anything that specifically accommodates a need that our customer needs? And then really, I want to hit this idea of unmatched customer service. And I want to hit really two things. First of all, in our case, when you call, you talk to a person, that person's dedicated to your account. And then really, we service all the warranties on everything. So, you don't have to go to the manufacturer and go through that headache. Instead, we service warranties. And I know how important that is because I'm doing some home improvements and I have to go from vendor to vendor, trying to get these warranties processed. It's just easier if it's all in one place. And the last thing I say is, when you think of a vendor, think of like, how people oriented are these vendors? So, we think about this, School Outfitters really does a lot to invest in its people. And we have this thing called the School Outfitters way. And the very first thing is to believe in people. So that's definitely something that that kind of it tips our hand to say, we really do care about the interplay among people and the work that we do. And so I really wanted to thank you for attending this webinar. I hope you got some good ideas out of it. And I just want to take the time we have left to see if we have any questions. I'm looking at the chat and the Q&A, and I'm not seeing anything right now. Give it a quick second here. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties that happened at the beginning of the session. I don't know what happened with the advancing of the slides, but I'm glad it kind of came back. My email address is greg.nelson@schooloutfitters.com. Our website is www.schooloutfitters.com. And we'd love to help you to work through whatever your needs are. All right, and with that, thank you, everybody. I appreciate it, and have a good rest of the day.